There are books I cannot think about without immediately remembering who I was when I first read them. Not just the plot, not even the characters sometimes. I remember the room, the season, the version of my life surrounding the book at the time. And years later, seeing the same cover again somewhere can bring back entire emotional periods almost instantly. I've always loved that about reading, the way books quietly attach themselves to our lives. I remember carrying great expectations around with me for weeks once during a period where I felt vaguely dissatisfied with almost everything, though I probably couldn't have explained why at that time. And what stayed with me wasn't even the story itself initially, it was atmosphere. The marshes, the fog, the strange sadness hanging over Satie's house, the feeling that every character in the novel seemed haunted slightly by the person they wished they had become. I underlined constantly while reading it, far too much, honestly, entire paragraphs, which is usually a sign someone is trying very hard to become a more serious person through literature. And then, years later, rereading the same copy, I noticed something strange. The passages that affected me now weren't even underlined at all. Instead, completely different sentences had become devastating, smaller ones, quieter observations I barely noticed the first time. And reading my own old annotations felt oddly intimate, like hearing an earlier version of myself thinking out loud in the margins. I think rereading books reveals more about the reader than the book, because books do not remain emotionally fixed, we change beside them. A novel read at 19 is not the same novel at 30, even if every word remains identical. I think timing matters enormously in reading. There are books you encounter too early, books that remain closed emotionally until enough life has happened to you first. And then, years later, you return to them, almost accidentally, and suddenly a sentence feels unbearably precise, as though the book had simply been waiting patiently for you to become the right person first. I felt this very strongly reading Ishiguro, especially The Remains of the Day. The first time I read it, I admired it intellectually, the restraint, the atmosphere, the precision of the prose. But reading it later felt completely different. Suddenly, the novel became painful. Not dramatic pain, quiet pain. The kind that arrives slowly while you're still pretending you're unaffected by it. You begin noticing all the emotional life Stephen quietly sacrifices in order to remain the version of himself he believes the world requires. And what affected me most wasn't even what was spoken openly in the novel, it was everything left unsaid. The pauses, the hesitations, the emotional negotiations happening silently underneath ordinary conversation. I think some books only become fully visible after disappointment enters your life properly, or loneliness, or uncertainty. Certain emotional experiences unlock entire dimensions within literature that simply did not exist beforehand. And maybe that's why readers become attached not only to books, but to periods of reading. A novel during illness, an essay discovered accidentally during a difficult year, a poem read repeatedly at 2 in the morning because it somehow articulates something you cannot explain to anybody else properly. I still remember finding old receipts inside books years later and immediately reconstructing entire emotional periods of my life from them. Train tickets, dates written hurriedly on first pages, coffee stains, bent corners. Books become accidental archives, not only of literature, but of who we were while reading. And then there are books that arrive less as companionship and more as confrontation. Kafka felt like that to me, especially The Trial. I remember reading it for the first time and feeling strangely unsettled for days afterward, not because I fully understood it, but because I understood enough. The instability of meaning, the strange anxiety of systems that never explain themselves properly, the feeling that life itself sometimes operates according to emotional rules we only partially understand. It's a difficult novel, intentionally difficult. But I think difficult books matter, not because confusion is intellectually impressive, but because life itself is often confusing in ways people rarely admit openly. We spend enormous amounts of time pretending certainty, pretending coherence, pretending we fully understand ourselves. And then literature arrives occasionally and says, no, human beings are contradictory, emotionally unfinished, often unclear even to themselves. And strangely, there's comfort in that too. I think books accompany people through becoming more than through certainty. A good novel rarely solves your life, but sometimes it makes your confusion feel shared. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that has always been enough. I sometimes wonder whether serious readers are really collecting books or collecting former versions of themselves. Because every shelf eventually becomes a kind of emotional history. Who you were, what frightened you, what you longed for, who you hoped to become. And somewhere among all those pages, certain sentences continue waiting patiently for future versions of you to arrive. This has been Notes After Rain.